Falling Walls Circle, Challenges and Foresight. Welcome to the Falling Walls plenary table, Wildfire Resilience. Harnessing data, models and AI.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm really excited about the discussion that we're going to have over the next 50 minutes or so. As many of you are aware, wildfires are increasing in number, severity, and speed across the globe, often with devastating impacts to communities and human livelihoods. Meanwhile, the sheer volume of data that we have available and the ways we process and use those data are ever expanding. However, the problem persists, and the question remains: how can we harness these powerful new tools and data sets to increase our resilience to wildfire? The speakers we have with us today are doing just that. Through innovative solutions in Earth observation and modeling of fire spread through both human communities and surrounding landscapes, they are charting a new path to a more resilient fire future. Today's discussion will be focused on developing an understanding of the wildfire problem while leaning forward to discuss how we can leverage these new tools and data to ensure a resilient future where humans and ecosystems can both thrive with fire. So with that, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists today. To my left, we have İlkay Altıntaş, who is the Chief Data Science Officer at the San Diego Supercomputer Center at the University of California, San Diego. She is a founding faculty fellow of the Halicıoğlu Data Science Institute and also the founding director of the Societal Computing Innovation Lab, where she focuses on novel approaches for creating breakthrough technological innovations that address complex societal challenges. Welcome, İlkay.
Thank you.
Next, we have Hassam Mahmoud, who is an endowed chair of engineering at Vanderbilt University. He is the director for sustainability, energy, and climate, and a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. His research focuses on complex systems to achieve sustainable and resilient infrastructure and communities. With over 350 publications, Hussam is an international authority on these topics and has been highly recognized for his contributions and leadership in the field. Welcome, Mahmoud.
Thank you.
Cecilia Mambile is a researcher in information, communication science, and engineering at the Nelson Mandela African Institution of Science and Technology, and an assistant lecturer at the University of Dodoma with a background in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Her research focuses on deep learning applications for forest fire prediction, integrating satellite imagery, weather patterns, and human activity data to enhance disaster prevention strategies. She is also the CEO of Smart Earth Solutions, where she develops AI-based solutions for early prediction of fire and risk management. Cecilia is also part of the Falling Walls Female Science Talent Intensive Track for 2025. Welcome, Cecilia.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Karen O'Connor. Karen has spent much of her career driving innovation programs in government, private, and philanthropic sectors, working alongside frontline operators in defense and emergency services. Karen is the founding principal of the Earth Fire Alliance, a global community-led nonprofit organization aiming to deliver transformative real-time data from all wildfires on Earth. Welcome, Karen.
Thanks.
And then finally, I'd like to introduce Dave Winokur. Dave is a retired fire chief that spent 21 years in the California Fire Service. He served as the Western Fire Chiefs Association California Director and on the California Wildfire Mitigation and Risk Modeling Advisory Working Groups. At Stanford University, he is a Hoover Institution Veteran Fellow, and in the private sector, he is co-founder of Xyloplan Risk, a wildfire risk assessment and visualization company. Welcome, Dave. All right, so I'd like to start the discussion today a little bit by setting the context and discussing a little bit about the wildfire problem across different parts of the world and getting a few people to give some feedback on that. So Dave, I want to start with you. I'm hoping you can help us set the context a bit by describing some of your experience as a fire chief in California. What did you observe and learn in your 21-year career in that role? And how has the situation changed in that time? And if you could touch a little bit on how you use data, technology, and models to support managing fire over that time frame, that would be great.
Absolutely. I think the first and most obvious thing is we're having more fires, and those fires are having greater consequences. So not necessarily the number of fires, but the outcomes of those fires have dramatically changed, which suggests that between climate change, increasing the frequency and the length of the weather conditions that will support extreme fire spread, the development of the wildland-urban interface without consideration for the engineering factors that would make homes or communities of homes resilient, and with a history of fire exclusion that resulted in the buildup of choked vegetative fuels that are capable of generating not only spread rates, but intensities that take them outside of the range within which we can suppress. All of those come together to suggest we are at the end of the line for a suppression first, fire exclusion approach. I think the results of the last 10 years of fire in California make that abundantly clear. The second component, though, is that because we have those vulnerable communities in fire-dependent landscapes, we have created an imperative to suppress all fires, irregardless of the fact that everyone at a gathering such as this or at a fire conference would agree that fire exclusion is how we got here. But we protect life, then we protect property, then we protect the environment with regard to our priorities. And if life and property are threatened, then environmental considerations associated with the return of beneficial fire to the landscape take a back seat. And so there's enormous political pressure and societal pressure to put these fires out and just make the problem go away. And what that has suggested is that we need a new approach. And that's where data and the increasing availability of not only data, but the tools to make sense, to sense and to make sense in this case, are very helpful for letting us understand where there are mitigations that can be carried out in advance of a fire that will make a community more adapted or resilient, such that it can be in or adjacent to a fire perimeter without experiencing loss. And as those tools come online, that then allows us to sharpen the allocation of our resources and of our messaging, primarily breaking down a community's resistance to change, to implement mitigations at scale so that fewer homes will burn. Because at the end of the day, and my area of expertise is not in landscape level issues or environmental concerns. My area of expertise is how do we set conditions so that fewer homes will be lost to fire in a given year. And as we make progress on that front, and as our communities are brought up to a level of resiliency that they should have been designed for from the outset, as we're able to retrofit those measures, that will set conditions for a more permissive use of managed fire, both planned and unplanned ignitions, so that our fire-dependent landscapes can be brought back into balance. And I think there's an enormous role for data to play in that effort.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. So I want to get some perspectives from people from other parts of the world. So you gave a very U.S.-focused answer, which is your context. But in different parts of the world, the fire issues are different. So Cecilia, I'm hoping you can tell us about the fire situation in Africa and how fires there impact ecosystems and human communities. And then touch a little bit on some of the barriers that in your work you have to integrating data science and technology into some of the solutions.
I will begin by grounding this in what we see in Africa. 3 years ago, on the evening of October 2022, I was in Mosh when I noticed a strange light on Mount Kilimanjaro. At first, it looked like just a small line of fire above the forest. But within hours, that line became a wall of fire on Africa's highest mountain. So I went closer and stood watching as the fire spread. The heat was so strong, the smoke so thick, that I saw monkeys and birds running out in fear to escape. People trying very hard to stop the fire, and the fire spread so fast. And sadly, it was not stopped within the first 2 days, because it was too strong and outpowered everyone trying to fight it. So the news reached the Tanzanian media and soon the whole world. And within that chaos, one thought hit me, that we were not ready. That experience has never left me. And that night changed everything. It's the reason I chose to dedicate my PhD research in forest fire prediction, because behind every fire, there are human lives, wildlife, and forests that could be protected if we act in time. In recent years, this wildfire, like the one I witnessed on Kilimanjaro, have become bigger and more destructive than ever. We have seen deadly fires in other parts of the world, like Portugal, Spain, and California, where the whole neighborhoods were destroyed. These fires move fast, burn very quick, and they put pressure on nature, economies, emergency teams, and people's daily life. And climate change is the major cause, but it's not the only one. How we use land, build cities, and exploit natural resources also increases fire risks, even in places once thought safe. Traditional fire seasons are disappearing, and now the danger is present almost all year. And with these fires growing faster than ever, you might think data would be our best defense. And it should be. But here is a paradox. We are drowning in data, yet starving for insights. But lack of information is not the problem, but fragmentation is a problem. Different data sets speak different languages. Some, like Moody's alerts, are open and free. But others, like high-resolution drones or Himawari 8 data, are locked behind paywalls or permissions. The results, critical insights, often sit out of reach, and especially for the people who need them the most.
That's great, thank you. And I want to touch on that piece again about the transition of data and tools into operations a little bit later in the discussion today, but I'd also like to get Karen's perspective. Karen, you're joining us from Australia, so I want you to tell us a little bit about the fire situation in Australia, and then if you can touch on the needs of various communities in Australia with regard to using data and technology to support fire management.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. As everyone would know, Australia is a very fire-prone country. Every state and territory in our country has a fire story of some kind or other. And everyone would have seen the 2019-2020 fires, which devastated the East Coast. And, you know, like what Cecilia is talking about, you know, it blankets whole regions in smoke. It's very unhealthy for communities, and it's very unhealthy for ecosystems. The reality we had with that 2019-2020 fire is that it defied most of the models that we had for fire. So the data was there, the models were there, but really they were not all that helpful when you get to a situation where you have a fire of that scale and intensity. And so that's something that we're starting to now grapple with, I think, across the world. What some people in this room might not know is that you would have seen the 2019-2020 fires all over the news, but 2023, actually, we had a fire that was about 3 or 4 times that size. But it was not near people and populations, and so you didn't hear about it on the news, even in Australia, very much. With all of that, I think what I would say about the experience in Australia with respect to the fire agencies that I work with, they use a range of tools that help them, and a lot of what their work is done long before the fire season. We don't have a suppression policy in Australia. There's a lot of work done to reduce the fuels in the landscape, both done by fire agencies themselves with hazard reduction burns, which are medium intensity fires targeted at pulling fuel out of that landscape. But there's also a lot of cultural practices that remain in Australia as well with the Indigenous communities, where they're lower intensity fires conducted throughout the winter, where they're done for pulling out fuel load, but they're also done to help to balance the ecosystems as well. And there's a lot of vegetation in Australia, as in California, that actually requires fire for germination. So that's actually a practice that is more than just about controlling fires. And those practices, I'd love to point out that those Indigenous practices are actually generating carbon credits because their work is reducing the chances of bigger fires happening that would release greater emissions. And I think they're the kinds of projects that I think data can be really, really useful for. When we're looking at those kinds of practices in the winter months, the biggest problem we have with the changing climate is that the windows to do those are getting smaller and smaller. And so having data that helps people to understand when to safely practice that and how to safely practice that in different ecosystems, I think is going to be really, really valuable. And being able to also assess the efficacy of those types of practices so that they can be scaled to other regions safely, I think is really key.
Great, thanks, Karen. So I want to turn to Hussam. So a large portion of your work is focusing on modeling fire spread through communities. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your work and how models in AI are useful in supporting community fire resilience. And maybe if you could touch a little bit on this piece of that we were talking about with Cecilia about transitioning technology. I know there's lots of barriers there. So if you could talk about some of your work where you're focused on that and some of the approaches that you've been using.
Sure. So we've been working on trying to understand how fire propagates across communities for about 10 years. And I came to this from a structural engineering background. I'm a structural engineer by training. So in my structural engineering worlds, where we look at the behavior of buildings, we work on two premises. First, I have to understand what the behavior is. Second, I must validate my model. Because if we're going to propose certain retrofit schemes or modification to design provisions, I have to do that on the premise that my model has been validated. So when we started to look at the wildfire problem 10 years ago, two observations were made. First, there are no models that allows you to understand how fire propagates across communities. There were a lot of wonderful work and models that were developed for wildland fire propagation. But once the fire gets in the wildland-urban interface or inside communities that are predominantly buildings, dominated by the built environment, like the LA fire, there was nothing. So we started the idea of developing models that allows us to understand how the fire will propagate, and we wanted to make sure we validate these models. Because we're trying to come up with mitigation strategies based on these models in a very uncertain time as far as the climate goes and as far as many weather conditions, these models have to be fast because you have to do probabilistic analysis in a way that allows you to communicate risk. If you want to communicate risk, you have to do thousands of simulations. So that's kind of what we did. We've been successful in developing a model that has been validated against a number of fire cases in the US. We've validated against the Camp fire and the Marshall fire and many others. And the idea here is that can we capture the fire boundary, and then once we capture the boundary, can we capture the damage inside the boundary? And so that work has been moving forward, and I would make a comment on an earlier panel today when Jenny Biggs was on a panel, and she said, not everything has to be perfect. We have to go with something. Our validation is great, but it's not perfect. And actually, if it's perfect, something is wrong with the model. But because we are at a very good stage, now we're starting to actually take this model and scale it. AI can help quite a bit. There has been a number and actually uptick, as you might know, in the use of AI in many applications. Wildfires is one of them. I've seen lots of work on wildfire modeling using AI for wildland. For communities, it's still, there's maybe a couple models only. And they're very limited because the data is limited. So a lot has to be done in that sense. But AI can be used not only to model the fire, but it can use to allow you to collect the data. So for example, in our model, which is based on graph theory, so it's not an AI model, we need a lot of data on the built environment and vegetation and so on. So we developed a deep learning model, and now we can fly drones and drive with cars with cameras on top of the cars and capture images. We feed them into our deep learning model, and it tells me what's what. So I don't have to spend the time walking home to home, collecting the data manually. Although there's an aspect of interaction with community residents that is, there's a lot of value in that. But of course, it takes super long time and resources. So AI can help with modeling, but we need a lot of data, but it can also help you collect the data, and we're doing that. In terms of upscaling the work and working with communities, we've been very fortunate to do that with a large number of communities in the US. We're working with about 30 communities through the Moore Foundation, and also 18 more communities that reached out. The problem with the scaling, of course, is that I work in the world of modeling, right? Communities don't necessarily under the model. So we need a middle person that allows, that for one thing, can take a lot of the burden off of our shoulders of trying to communicate and do the logistics aspects of working with communities, but also can take our work and communicate it in a better way. Because, while I can, communicate efficiently to some extent, I'm not as good as someone who's trained in that area. But the scaling of the solutions is an incredibly important element that has to be explored a lot more. And I think having solutions is wonderful. Not scaling them is a massive obstacle moving forward. So we got to figure out a good mechanism to do that.
Great, thank you. And my understanding is also that one of the limitations to some of the model development and validation is a lack of observations. We simply don't have a lot of measurements of active fire. And I know, Karen, your work at Wildfire Alliance, you're aiming to make a big shift in the amount of observations available to support wildfire science and management across the globe. So could you tell us a little bit about what you all are trying to do at EFA?
Sure. Thanks. We saw that there was a big gap in the data. You know, as you heard from Cecilia, some data is available to everyone. Some of the data is not. Some of the data is coarser than you need, Hassam. Some of the data is a little too detailed. What we wanted to do at Earthfire Alliance is be able to provide consistent information on a global scale of every fire on Earth and do it in a way that we can follow the dynamics of the fire. What we are looking to do is actually launch a constellation of satellites we're calling FireSat. It's the first of its kind, specifically designed by the fire community for the fire community, so that we can have a level of data that is useful and bespoke to this problem space, because a lot of the data that's been used is collected for other things. It's somewhat useful, but having something that's actually fit for purpose really, hopefully, will change the game as far as us understanding how fire is working in the landscape and how we can work with it. What we're aiming for with this constellation is to actually have an 80-meter average resolution and a 20-minute revisit. So that means we can actually see a fire from the time it is 5 by 5 meters. That's the size of a single car garage, and be able to follow that fire through its lifetime as it spreads through the landscape, getting an update every 20 minutes. And our intention is to provide that data to every agency in the world so that everyone gets uplifted at the same time, and provide that data to every researcher that is working and supporting these agencies that are on the front line, so that we can actually have a foundation for new scientific knowledge on fire behavior and help us to really lift, because as you heard from a number of people around the panel, it is an urgent situation right now. And I think there's a couple of key things that really will be critical to the success of that, and that is the quality and quantity of the data. That's what we're aiming for with FireSat, but that data is equitably available and everyone gets the opportunity to use it to change how they're making decisions with respect to fire. But also that because it is such a global problem, we need a global response, and collaboration really is key in how we're going to be able to use this data. This data by itself is just data. For us, working with researchers, working with operational people on the ground is the key to ensuring that this data gets turned into insights and that we're able to actually make change for wildfire resilience.
That's great. Thanks, Karen. So, Ilkay, I'd like to go to you next. And I'd like to hit on two things. One is the collaboration piece that Karen ended on, and then also open data. So I know you do a lot of work in that realm. So can you talk a little bit about how you see us coming together as a community across sectors to make progress on this problem, and perhaps give us an example from your work about how you're doing that?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and something I spent a lot of time thinking over the last couple of decades. So first is understanding, of course, this data and AI we are talking about has a lot of potential to be useful. And over the last decade, we made so many advances as a community. But the key to making it useful is recognizing it's not a technical problem, but a societal one. So we are doing this, and who we are doing this, why we are doing this, is rooted in society, and it also has to be rooted in operational context, that intelligence and insights we are talking about comes together in the context of society. So we need to come together, as Karen said, as communities. Right? Those communities involve research, academia, profit, funders, all kinds of people, and of course the fire service, fire management, land management. We need to co-design solutions, and here I underline that they need to be scientifically rigorous and operationally useful. We can't have and not the other, right? We need to have both. And how do we do that? We need to open up science and data silos. And that's, in a way, what we are doing in the Wildfire program, and also more broadly in the context of the Societal Computing and Innovation Lab. So our tools, in that sense, let it be for fire response or prescribed fire management, built hand in hand with the people who use them, and also in a way that amplifies the human experience with AI and insights and science, rather than, in a way, replacing it. Right, so there is no tech push here, and we can't be tech-centered pushing the tech approach when we talk about data and AI. And more broadly now, we are building to an enabling platform that we call Commons to bring communities together. So at the heart of that is the people who are coming together, and an enabling platform to open up the silos and bridge them, link them, not break them. So we are not breaking the silo walls, but linking them in a way. And so it's a commons in a way where people come together as a collective rather than reinventing things in isolation. And the progress will not come from more data or faster compute. We need to recognize that rather than create a shared ownership of the solution. Like everyone working on it, we need to build an ecosystem of local knowledge, innovation, science, and technology. And I think we need to think of this as a long term, in the next 10 years maybe, but also in 50 years, where we are going to be. And the wildfire problem is complex, and we are slowly losing rather than really creating a winning solution. So I think we really, this way, if we think about how do we win in the long term, by creating rapid solutions, I think we can then make every fire a little bit more predictable now, a little, like every prescribed fire a little safer, and every community a little bit more resilient. And those little bits, hopefully in the long term, turn into a winning solution.
Great, thank you. Okay. We have about 7 or 8 minutes before we'll go to the audience for questions. So if just those in the audience that have questions, start thinking about what you might want to ask. Another question I have for you all, and I think we'll start with Cecilia on this one, is, across the globe, we are seeing that the most destructive fires are driven by extreme weather events, including intense wind, extreme heat, hyper flash droughts, which manifest at hyper-local scales. And as such, they can be very difficult to predict. So I'm curious about what are some strategies that we can use to gain ground and improve wildfire prediction, management, and resilience given this? And if you could give us an example of some of the work that you've been doing, I know, with your the application you're developing.
Okay. Resilience starts by people, not technology. And tools only matter if they support real decision made by people on the ground, often under immense pressure. So first, fire prediction must be locally useful. A European model means little to Tanzanian ranger unless it's become an alert they can actually use. Second, collaboration must cross borders, because the fire does not stop at the national boundary, but yet our responses often do. We need regional, even continental cooperation, because the air and the earth doesn't know our lines on the map. Then third, infrastructure is critical, because many communities do not lack awareness. They lack electricity, internet, or an alert on their local language. Without that, even best models is useless. Finally, we must redefine success, and the goal is not zero fires, but fewer catastrophic fires. And fire resilient future is about moving from reacting to preparing, stopping surprise ignition. It's a future where data, AI, and models are not abstract tools, but practical ones. In my research, I wanted to build something that will work not just in theory, but also in real life. I developed a deep learning model to predict forest fire in Tanzania, focusing on local realities. I combined satellite images, weather data, and human activity across Mount Kilimanjaro. The hardest part was not finding data. It was knowing which data mattered most. So I used vegetation indices to show pre-fire conditions, but also I added human patterns like farming, grazing, and traditional beekeeping, the everyday actions where the global dataset usually ignore, but they often spark the first frame. I validated the model using NASA's Wildfire fire alerts, and I tested it with local experts, the rangers, the local community members, and their feedback shaped it, because the value of the model is not how advanced it looks, but how quickly it supports decision and how easy it communicates the risk. This is the reason we have started to build a Fire Predict, a simple, accessible tool designed for early action in data-limited areas. When it's ready, we hope it will deliver early warning to the people who need them the most in the time they can make the difference. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we got a few more minutes before we can go to audience questions. I have one more question that I'll pose to the group here before we go to the audience, and whoever wants to answer can chime in. So I'm curious about, based on the discussion today and based on all the work you've done in your careers, peering around the corner, what do you think we can achieve in the next 5 to 10 years by applying some of what we discussed today?
I would say, and just backing up to emphasize that a wildland fire and a wildland-initiated urban fire are two fundamentally different phenomena, and they're often interlinked, and then we often apply the wrong mitigation strategy because we're applying it a forestry setting. Forestry application, urban setting, unsurprisingly, doesn't work. I think the things that are most accessible in the near term are using data, using modeling, using the outputs of that data and modeling to demystify the future and allow particularly our communities, places where we're asking residents to make changes on and around their homes, which is a very different problem set than doing things in a forested landscape or open spaces. Using these models and the outputs to show them what the future could look like, to demystify, to take them from the known to the known, instead of the known to the unknown, which we are currently asking for, certainly that we're seeing across the Western US and other fire-dependent landscapes. That's not a very successful strategy. So using these models to demystify and to help people understand the value of mitigations at a small scale, how those will aggregate to community benefits, I think there's very real opportunity, and the work being done by those at this table are bringing us much closer to that time now.
Great, thanks, Dave. Okay.
So to create a long-term solution in the next 5 to 10 years, we need to definitely think through what's the enabling collaborative culture and infrastructure for us to get there. And on top of that, focusing on small wins and successes so we can actually collaborate to show the wins and then change the culture through it, involve communities, and maybe change the culture around it's not like war with fire, but we can actually make some peace with it if we understand its behavior and think of it as a part of the solution. And that's, I think, going to set us in the right path for long-term success.
Great, thanks. Hussam, got thoughts on that?
I would definitely say to reach success, we have to collaborate with communities a lot more. I feel that now we got to the point where we've managed to show that the models actually predict, even when it comes to some of the intense fires, we can get the fire boundary, we can get the fire damage. I think we need to be linked with communities a lot more so that we can actually apply the work and scale it up. One of the other things I want to say, as we work on the short-term plan and make sure we have some wins, we need to not overlook opportunities that allows us to reduce risk at other levels associated with wildfires. you talk about ecosystem services. It's linked to how mitigations are proposed on the home level and on the wildland and inside communities. When you talk about water quality, water clarity, when you talk about heavy metals that are released from buildings and what they would do to public health, these are all things that we cannot overlook now until we get to the, building damage kind of part figured out. We need to start to develop these layers and couple them together to understand the interdependencies within these systems so that we can go in and break these interdependencies and isolate these systems so that the solutions actually work. I just hate that to see that we end up focusing on one thing, and after 5 years and we say, oh, what else is there to work on now? I think we need to think bigger picture until we get there.
Great, thanks. All right, I think we're going to transition to the audience for the next 10 minutes or so for some questions, and then we'll have a final question for the panel. Anybody? It's a little hard for me to see. Oh, we have a question over there. He's got a microphone coming.
Thank you so much for this very engaging talk. My question was surrounding the issue of working with communities. So how can we work with communities by bringing together indigenous epistemologies without imposing hegemonic narratives surrounding things such as AI and the current modes of data collection and interpretation? So my question is more around what Ilkay and Cecilia were discussing. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You want to take it first, or should I? Okay. So indigenous communities in general actually used fire for so many reasons. I'm not a total expert in that area, but definitely we are working with indigenous groups in terms of what we refer to as cultural burns, for instance. Indigenous people are used to being on land, using fire to actually work on the land, but also for cultural practices that brings that community together with spiritually and practically together around their culture. So one thing to understand, I think it's not just Western science, but we need to really connect to those cultural characteristics of those communities and respect them. And there is a place where culture and science can work together. And more, as we work with such communities, I'm noticing actually climate change and other impacts on the landscape is causing these communities to actually not be able to be as insightful about land and how it's used. Let it be in agriculture, let it be in land management or cultural practices too. So they're actually really open to working together in a way that's led by them. Right? So we need to think through how we can actually engage and how we can listen and really create solutions together there in a respectful manner.
Great. Cecilia, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yes. In my case, I included this.
Your mic is out for some reason.
In my case,
Okay.
thank you. In my case, I included the community by engaging during the model validation. I included the local community members and the local rangers, local experts within the area of Mount Kilimanjaro, because I wanted to get their knowledge during the validation of the model, because this local knowledge is useful. And without that, we must discover that we have the smartest system that failed the people they were meant to protect.
An important point as it relates to data, come up on that is we think of privacy on people. Whereas for especially indigenous communities, is a lot of the times privacy is on the land. So data sovereignty definitely is a part of it. But in general, thinking of the land and how we are collecting data about the land as it relates to these communities from the air and from all kinds of ways is important, at least creating some awareness that the data you're getting that's open belongs to that tribal community or this type of nation. So we started tagging those in our data systems as at least bringing up you're about to use open data about this tribal nation, at least bringing some awareness to it.
You have a thought?
Well, I think one of the biggest things, coming from the Australian ecosystem is that I think there is an assumption that data and technology is quite separate from the Indigenous communities, when in actual fact, Indigenous and First Nations people are really making very good use of data and very good use of geospatial information for their own ends. And so I think we can learn a lot about how they choose to use that information rather than putting it on them in a way that makes sense to us.
Thanks, Karen. Other questions from the audience? We have one back there.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. I'd like to hear from the panel. How can we maximize the efficiency of early warning system, even in forests or in others? How can we identify what should we do and when? Because acting at the right time is the most important. And also nowadays we have a lot of models, we have a lot of data, but in some cases, to take action at the right time for the right reason, it's difficult to do that. So we are looking forward to learn from the panel.
That's a great question.
Thank you much.
I'll take the first crack at that, which is first we need to understand what we're trying to achieve. And if we're worried about protecting resources, and particularly trees, we need to reduce intensity. If we're worried about protecting communities, we need to reduce speed. Hot fires don't burn communities, fast fires don't burn trees. And so understanding what the goal is a precondition. And to do that, we have to prioritize, because we can't do everything everywhere, but we can't do nothing until we can do everything everywhere. And having a plan that includes prioritization and identifying what are the meaningful blocks of geographic extent, and then what is the meaningful prescription within that block that will be effective, that will achieve the minimum number needed to treat, but won't go beyond the point of marginal diminishing returns. And without a plan, without the data, without the analysis of the data, too often we reduce ourselves to carrying out activity for the sake of activity and being very performative in our approach to wildfire risk reduction.
Thanks, Dave. That's a great point.
I will just say, this is a great question. The idea of response becomes very critical because the system is not static. It's a dynamic system that is changing. Even when you intervene during an event, you're changing the system, right, as firefighters and how it will unfold. There's definitely a disconnect between the response, real time. There has been great work. People are looking at evacuation strategies and so on, but it's not at the level where it can be applied across communities. We are currently working with a small town in southern Colorado to perform live evacuation simulation, where we will use our model, the fire will run through, the warning will go, and actually currently they use the bell in the church, right, to warn people because they don't have robust communication systems. People will evacuate, then we will change the conditions real time in terms of the wind and so on, and we will come up with new evacuation strategy that we're hoping to communicate to the communities and see the response time for the community. This will happen likely next year. We're in the process of planning that. But that's to say is that we have not explored a lot of the issues you mentioned. And every community is different, the resources are different, the scale is different, the response and people behavior is different, depends on your background and your age and your risk perception, right? Perception. I actually will just say quickly a very interesting story. I was presenting some of the work to the community residents, and this community includes people that have different political backgrounds. One of them came up to me and he was excited about the work, and he said, "You know what? I have a plan when the fire comes." And I said, "What's your plan?" And he said, "I have a parachute and I'm gonna take it and I will jump off the cliff." And I said, "Well, do you think that's going to work?" He said, "Yeah, I think that's going to work." And his wife was standing right next to him. And I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" She said, "I'll jump with him." So I said, I am hoping that we'll get to the point where we don't have to do that. And using the tools and working with communities, we can get to the point where everybody can evacuate safely. And hopefully we don't have to see these crazy stunts, happen in front of us.
That's great. We've got a little bit of time, maybe a minute before we go to the last question. So you have a thought? Okay.
I do. I think even for something like early warning, we think, oh, early warning, great, but who is it for? Is it for the municipality? Is it for fire service? Is it for the people? And when is that going to be actionable by who? So warning is good, but we need to also prepare the workflows and human processes so that we actually can make that warning actionable. And I think we are coming to a world where now warnings are achievable and possible, but as Hussam was saying, or Dave was saying, applying it in the context and building the solution around that is important. So I think democratizing means that warning should be available when that either the ignition starts or the risk is identified. But then the real innovation is putting it in the context of that solution and giving it to the hands of people who need that warning.
Great, thank you. Thanks for those great questions. So we're going to wrap up by asking the final question of the day, and then we'll go around really quickly. We have about 4, maybe 5 minutes if we can get some extra time to answer this. So what is the next step we have to take to break down the wall to deliver an enduring win in this global wildfire challenge rather than just losing more slowly?
Start?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay. I'd like to break the wall between people and fire. Right now, we operate in 2 different nodes. And I think we can understand fire behavior is enough that people actually can be collaborating with fire in some contexts. And selfishly, I'd also like to build a wall of communities and link them through data and enabling platforms so we can achieve better reproducible solutions that we can all understand.
Nice. Sam?
Yeah, I'd say we are starting as a community to have, I think, the pieces that we need to put together. I think we need to embrace the complexity of the problem and not work in silos. I mean, this is a perfect example where silo doesn't work. If I want to come up with a good mitigation strategies to reduce risk to communities, I have to couple the built environment with ecological systems. Right now, they're decoupled. People who work here do not talk to people who work there. So we need to break the silos, embrace the complexity, layer different layers together so that when we come up with mitigation strategies, they actually do work at the end of the day. And I think if we're able to do that, we'll have great wins.
Great, thanks. Cecilia?
For me, the next steps is not about more models or more data. It's about the right data in the right time, at the right context, for the right people. And these fires will keep coming. How we made them, that part is still up to us.
Thank you. Karen?
I think for me, the next step is global. We've had a lot of wins at local levels. Each region works differently with fire or against fire. But I think we now have a decade coming where there are regions that have never experienced fire that are going to be dealing with that. And so it's up to us who have developed knowledge in this space to actually help our neighbors, help those that haven't had to deal with fire throughout this time to really lift, because if they don't lift very quickly, we are going to be in a state of potential panic.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Dave?
I think the biggest one is going to be accepting that those who live in fire-dependent landscapes, fire is a feature, not a bug. It is recurring, it is beneficial, it is inevitable. And that we have to be very careful as we develop new tools and new insights, that if those tools and insights outpace the community's willingness to be fire adapted and to accept the reality of this is a force of nature that cannot be denied, that these tools will be ended up being used in ways they were not intended. I say this as a career firefighter. If we give them a bigger hammer, they're going to hit the nail harder. And early detection can very quickly become an enhanced tool to further exclude fire from the landscape and all down the line of the things we're doing. So ensuring that the technology is moving apace with the adaptation and the community will to accept fire as a beneficial feature on the landscape.
Great. Thanks, Dave, and thanks everybody for an engaging discussion. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to the audience for some great questions, and we hope we can continue these conversations later today and throughout the rest of the week here at Falling Walls. So feel free to engage as you see us in the different networking events. Thank you all.
Thank you.